Good morning. My name is Lori Fry, and on behalf of the Alliance of Women in Workers' Compensation, I want to welcome you to today's webinar. Today's webinar is entitled Leading with Empathy and will last approximately 50 minutes and is being broadcast today, August 25th, 2022. Before we get started, I would like to thank our 2022 corporate sponsors for their support on hosting events such as this. They support us not because they want their logos up on a screen, but because they support the cause, which is to affect positive change in the workers' compensation industry through networking, supporting, mentoring, and collaboration. The Alliance is inclusive of all professionals in workers' compensation, regardless of career stage, with the belief that we can all learn from and support each other. Be sure to head to the Alliance website for all upcoming events. We are excited to be hosting webinars, collaboration sessions, and in-person events throughout 2022. Be sure to check back on our website for registration details. If you cannot make one of our live virtual or in-person events, don't worry. All events will be recorded and on demand for our followers. Our theme this year is Acknowledge, Adjust, Advance. Each quarter, our webinars and events will be centered on each mini theme. This quarter, we focus our topics around evolving the norm. Be sure to join in these discussions as we facilitate both virtual and in-person events. Have you joined our book club yet? This year, we launched our 2022 book club with 6 books to choose from, all by previous keynote speakers the Alliance had at events in 2021. If you love reading books, be sure to head to the Alliance website to sign up to join the club. Change is preceded by trust. It is through acceptance and inclusion that trust will be formed and positive impact will occur. The Alliance is committed to creating a safe space in the workers' compensation industry for women of diverse backgrounds and experiences through a shared culture that integrates various perspectives. This is who we are and who we will be. The time to be better and do better is now. The Alliance understands that diversity is a journey that will take time to make meaningful changes for our organization, its followers, and its supporters. We will be intentional in making progress along our key pillars of change. For today's webinar, we are so pleased to have a conversation between industry leaders regarding leading with empathy. Our speakers have a variety of industry and leadership experience, and we'll use this time to discuss what is empathy, how they practice it, and the value it has both professionally and personally. The combined experience of our speakers will help you to develop the tools necessary to lead in all areas of your life with empathy. As this is a live interactive webinar, please feel free to comment and ask questions throughout the webinar using the Zoom chat feature seen on your screen. We will try to answer your questions as time permits. We love seeing our followers engage throughout the session. Thank you for the time you're spending with us today, and we truly hope you enjoy this webinar. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Women Alliance of Women in Workers' Compensation Leading with Empathy webinar. We're so thankful you guys are here and really excited for this topic. My name is Lori Fry, and I will be moderating today. And I can't wait to hear from all of our panelists. I'm sure everyone on the webinar is as well. But before we jump in, I do want to remind everyone about the chat feature. It is turned off right now. I will turn it on in one moment, get it live there. And once it is live, please type in your questions as we go throughout this session. We will definitely try and get to those and make sure that we are answering everyone's questions appropriately. And also, I will post a couple links throughout this webinar as well, and where you can go to the Alliance to look at past events and also upcoming events as well. So take a look in the chat throughout, participate in the chat, and we will get started. So first off, let's get some introductions from everyone. So let us know who you are, your background, and why this topic is important to you. So Tara, you want to kick us off?
Sure. Good morning, everyone, or at least it's good morning from Denver, Colorado. I am the Claims Director and Counsel for Lumen Technologies. We are a nationwide telecommunications and technology company. I oversee the casualty claims program, and I have done that role for about 15 years. I am on the employer advisory board / committee for the Alliance of Women in Workers' Compensation. And I felt that this topic was important because this is not a skill that came easily to me. So I definitely want to share my perspective on how I got better at it and how I keep it in mind as I go through my job every day.
Great. Brianna, you want to go next?
Hi, Brianna Levinson. I am an associate casualty advisor with Marsh. Marsh is one of the largest insurance brokerages. I focus on general liability, auto liability, workers' compensation, umbrella, and excess. I've been with Marsh for about 3 years, and prior to that, I was with another brokerage. My background is actually in psychology and nonprofit leadership. This webinar topic is extremely important to me. Being a former rehabilitation counselor for individuals with mental illness and substance abuse, empathy goes a long way, and it's nearly impossible to develop a relationship with someone who you are trying to help in their recovery process if you're unable to empathize and appear that you are there for them.
Wow, that's great. And Nikki.
Hello, good morning, everyone in the Alliance and our guests. I'm Nikki Jackson. I'm the Vice President of Strategy and Marketing at MTI America. I came to MTI with over 15 years of experience in the property and casualty and benefits delivery industry. I've worked on comp, liability, disability, FMLA, but comp is truly, my baby. It's my forte. During my career, I've affected almost every aspect of the claims management process, working with many Fortune 500 companies. I've led and worked with dozens of operational teams during my time with Liberty Mutual, Sedgwick, and at my current role with MTI. I've also partnered with countless vendors and other stakeholders. I'm an insurance nerd at my core, and empathy is important to me because I love this industry. We have a purpose-driven industry to help people, and we build those relationships through empathy. I just joined the Alliance recently too as an ambassador in the state of North Carolina. So looking forward to meeting some of our local Alliance members.
Great. And I love that the different perspectives everyone is going to have as we have this discussion. So, and I the learning, the growth that's still coming, like you said, Tara, and then also both personally, Brianna, you mentioned, and then professionally, Nikki, this is going to be a really great conversation. So really to kick it off, if I could ask you kind of your definition of empathy, or if you just want to kind of put in your own words, like what empathy means to you as you're kind of consciously thinking through being empathetic. So Tara, you want to kick that one off again?
Sure. So, while I said it was a difficult skill, I would say that it's the label that we put on it to say it's empathy. I think there's the underlying skills I have, but putting those labels on it was very insightful when I went through a particular leadership course that my company graciously included me in a couple of years ago. So for anyone who wants to look into this topic more, there's a company by the name of Korn Ferry, and that is the company that did this particular leadership class I did. And I went back to my Korn Ferry materials to really refresh myself on really from their perspective what empathy is. So I'm going to read it because I'm that kind of person. And I should have said from my background, I am a lawyer, so I'm all about resources and building on, words and case law kind of. Anyway, so with cognitive empathy, you can understand another person's perspective, reflect on their situation, and consider the forces that may be acting upon them. Emotional empathy allows you to sense unspoken feelings by reading facial expressions, tone of voice, and other nonverbals. Essentially, empathy is a way to gather information about the people around you. Given how much of a leader's job is managing relationships, leaders who lack empathy miss information. So keen empathy can strengthen leaders' understandings of their staff, their customers, and their external stakeholders. So that, to me, is where I start from when I think about empathy.
Yeah, Nikki, how about you? Any thoughts or anything to add to that definition?
Yeah, I kind of echo what Tara said there, but for me, in my mind, empathy is really all about understanding what others are feeling. So it's acknowledgement, care, listening, and then action. I think the best example that I can give that's so practical is our deck out back. It's kind of a hazard. There's nails that stick up out of it. So we're constantly going out there and kind of putting those back in so we don't hurt ourselves on it. But if I see my husband like hit his thumb with a hammer or something, what do? I wince and I cringe, and it's almost like I've experienced that pain too. And then immediately, I'm running to the freezer to get him an ice pack. So I think, Tara, based on the definition you gave, that would be more of an effective or emotional empathy. But I think it's one we can all relate to.
Yeah, for sure. And Brianna, how about you?
So to tailor off of what both Nikki and Tara said, I think Nikki's example was great because you really are putting yourself in someone else's position. But a big thing with empathy, I think oftentimes it gets confused with sympathy. And it's possible to have sympathy while you have empathy, but with sympathy, you're feeling bad for someone, but you're not necessarily putting yourself in their shoes or seeing things from their perspective and trying to understand. With sympathy, you're truly trying to, or with empathy, I'm so sorry, you're truly trying to understand what's going on and how they're feeling.
That is such a great point. And actually, I think that leads perfectly into my next question, because as leaders, we can be sympathetic. We can say, oh no, I'm so sorry that that's going on. And, but how do we then take that and evolve it to that empathy piece? So I'll start with you, Brianna, just to kind of lead into that. With leadership, how can you demonstrate that actual empathy piece? And also, why is that important?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are several ways I think that you can demonstrate empathy. And it's something that you also want to build as you build a relationship with someone, because you can't figure out how to best make yourself available to someone without learning their personality, their communication style. How do you adjust yourself to best fit with their communication style? That's a huge part, because if someone feels that they cannot be open and honest and have an open flow of communication, they're not going to open up to you or trust you and feel safe. And I think part of being an empathetic leader is creating a safe space for the people around you.
Yeah, I completely agree. And Tara, I know the definition that you read, there were leadership aspects in that. So how about you? What are your thoughts from a leadership perspective?
I think that it is really building the relationships with your team, and it's not to build the relationship solely for what you get out of it or being able to, lead them. I mean, I think it is really being your authentic self, showing, true interest in who they are, what they're doing, whatever the topic is, being present in that moment, having that conversation, asking them questions. Where are they coming from? Why they might have a different perspective than you. And taking all of the clues, verbal as well as nonverbal, in from that conversation, and then moving forward in whatever that conversation dictates. So I think overall, and I think that's why I had to learn that, like, there was this label. That's kind of who I was anyway, right? I was having those relationships. I was interested in everyone. I mean, everyone I meet, I'd like to know more about them. So it's just sort of putting a little bit of a definition around it. And that's, just how I would put it.
Yeah, I agree. Nikki, how about you? From a leadership
Yeah,
perspective, why is empathy important?
both of these ladies made great points here. I think the big thing is, finding the time for empathy. one-on-one conversations, continuing to have town halls with your organization, even if it seems untimely or, something big is happening and, you're worried some of the responses might not be favorable, is to really, again, as they said, listen to your team and then take action. Let them know that you've heard them, we heard you, we're creating a committee to address these issues, whatever it is. I think the listening, the acknowledgement, the caring, but then actually putting it into action is important too.
Yeah, I completely agree. And actually, so we do have a question in the chat from Faye, which sort of aligns with something I was thinking as you were all speaking, is that, we all want to be as empathetic as possible to our teams, to lead them and let them know that we are here to be the leaders, empathetic leaders that they need. But I was thinking in my head, is there ever a time you can be too empathetic? And then it kind of aligns with Faye's question, which is, where does judgment play a role in this? So, how do you make sure that you are being empathetic, but you are also still being a leader? You're being seen as a leader, and you also are not, maybe you are letting judgment play into it and you're not. What are any thoughts on that? Does anyone just off the bat want to take that question as far as where judgment might play a role in this and how you just find that balance?
I'll say that I mean, I think it really depends on the issue, right? Like, is it, does a decision have to be made where you have to have a judgment? Like you have to make a choice because there's two spectrums of the issue. But if it's not that sort of decision or not that conversation, then I think I would say you don't want to be judgment. You don't want to have that judgment. You recognize and you are cognizant of that other position, feeling, whatever. But you really have to not be judged. I don't know, judgment and judgmental can perhaps be close, maybe not. That's not exactly what the questioner is asking about. But as a leader, yeah, there are definitely positions that you're going to have to take. You're going to make a decision and go with one way or the other. And I think depending on how sensitive or charged that decision is, and you have to explain why you're doing it so that then the person understands that they've been heard, but you're the leader and you're going to, go with what you think is best for the situation.
Nikki, what about you? Any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, this is actually one of my kind of lesson learned takeaways. So after, like you, Tara, I unfortunately don't seem to have much of an empathetic gene about me. So it was very much something that I had to learn when I became a leader. And after leadership boot camp, it was this, 1-week program that our employer sent us to, and it was absolutely fabulous. But I came back and I was all gung-ho. I was going to be an empathetic leader. And unfortunately, I do think that having too much empathy can cloud your judgment and make employees feel less accountable. So just because I was actively practicing empathy, it didn't mean that I was immune to deception, narcissism, and, toxic employees. And I hope all of you know that you aren't either. So just, be careful. You're trying to show that kind nature, but you may have employees or partners that can take advantage of your empathy and your compassion and your willingness to help. So, they cross certain boundaries and they take and maybe never reciprocate. Can I give an example of this quick?
Always.
All right. So there was a team lead and she always was getting the raw end of the stick in her personal life, flat tire, kid with the flu, relationship breakups, medical emergencies, the list kind of went on and on. And again, this is after my leadership boot camp, so I'm being empathetic. I would find myself, reassigning her important diaries. She was an adjuster, and, looking at the payments that were supposed to be released for her team. And what started out as empathy on my part soon became this kind of one-sided manipulative relationship. And it was clear that she thought that she could get away without being held accountable. So that was a mistake that I had made. Then, employees on her team would go on vacation and she wouldn't jump in and help them. So I think really it's, Faye, to answer your question, finding that balance and understanding when to stand firm. If you've got someone who is taking advantage and not reciprocating, you've got to reevaluate your approach, take stock of what's really going on, and then look into those boundaries and the rights that may have been violated.
I think boundaries is a really great word there for this whole topic. And Brianna, I want to ask you as well with this question. I think, you had mentioned in your intro recovery and doing some work in that space. I mean, from a judgment perspective, what are your thoughts on that as well?
So from that perspective, one of the most important things is to check your judgment at the door. You just check it and you cannot bring it back out. You are able to have different opinions as long as you're able to convey them in a respectful manner that doesn't make someone feel like you're judging them or you're trying to seem that you're superior to them in a way, or you're trying to minimize their pain or whatever they may be going through. I think it still applies in the business world as well, and even amongst your colleagues, is you can hold back your judgment and try to see things subjectively or objectively instead of subjectively. And then if you're able to advocate your opinion or your perspective on an issue in a way that is non-threatening, but just the same way that you saw things from their perspective, allowing them to see something from your perspective, I think that that's really important in building that safe space we talked about earlier. And to Nikki's point as well, I mean, you need to make sure that while you're doing this, you're also setting boundaries with your colleagues, with your employees, with your direct reports, because you don't want people to take advantage of you. You can be empathetic and kind, but that doesn't necessarily mean you have to become a doormat either.
Yeah, I think that's entirely true. And it's a really good reminder that we're all still working on this and have to think through our interactions. And, Terry, you said it best to kick this off. We're all still learning here and growing. And, Nikki, I want to ask you a question in particular, because you've been very open about, not having that empathetic gene. And so having to work on it. But on the flip side, obviously, we're not all perfect. We're not all always going to get it right. That's why hopefully we're attending this webinar too, to get some tips. So Nikki, from your perspective, or just from your empathy journey, what are some things that haven't worked for you?
Well, I want to start with some context here, because although I did seem to lack that empathy gene, I think for me, it was a bit circumstantial when I was a new leader. And I think it might be for some of you too. So when I was first promoted into a leadership role, I inherited 1,200 past due diaries and tasks from my predecessors. And I'm not exaggerating. I think it was actually 1,203. In addition, the first 11 out of my 12 months, I was also responsible for a caseload. So we didn't have an adjuster, and I was managing that. So I was so overwhelmed, and I felt like I just didn't have the time to be empathetic. I don't think it was just, a matter of being lazy or anything like that. So the first thing that I've learned that didn't work was using canned responses. So you're kind of quasi listening, and then you say something like, hey, it's okay, cheer up or hang in there. And again, it wasn't intentional, it was inadvertent and a product of circumstance. But I hope that you all learn from my lesson and make sure that you're deliberate. The second lesson that I learned is that not all people respond to empathy. So in the roles that I've been in, this happens a lot when the employees thought that a situation wouldn't happen to them. So let's say, you're responsible for maybe you're an executive and you've got an operations manager, and your operations manager is really struggling to show empathy. And in this situation, maybe, 4 claims team leads, they quit in a 30-day window. It's pretty chaotic, right? So someone with low empathy, in this case, one of those ops managers, might have trouble connecting to other people's circumstances. So they think, oh, it's never going to happen to them, or that they couldn't, or that they could have handled the situation better, right? So I think to be careful there. And then the last lesson learned, I just gave the example of the adjuster that was always going through something difficult in her life and, maybe being taken advantage of there. So be careful with too much empathy too.
Yeah, I think those are all really great reminders and great that you've learned them as you've been working through your career and, the self-awareness to pick up on those. Brianna, I want to ask you specifically, Nikki was talking about things she's learned through her own experience, but how about for you from a particular leader? Is there anything that you learned either from a leader that was or was not empathetic and ways that you've now tried to incorporate that or not incorporate that?
So I think, I've been on both ends of the spectrum. I've had very empathetic leaders, and I've also had leaders who were completely not empathetic whatsoever. It's funny because both of them taught me similar things from a standpoint of, I've seen this person not be empathetic, not make this a safe environment to work in or a positive environment. And I think also being now in what I consider to be a safe, empathetic environment, both of those things have taught me that you need to make sure you are approachable and open and not just, okay, I'll listen to what you have to say. You have to listen, you have to hear to listen and be there and actually absorb what someone is saying, as opposed to just falling on deaf ears or listening because they feel like they have to. And you can definitely feel the difference in that when you're talking to someone. If someone's listening because they feel like they have to, they're likely not engaged, they're not making it conversational, or they're giving just brief, short answers. It's not a conversation. It's, I have to sit here, I am your boss, and I have to listen. But when you have someone who's actually willing to hear what you have to say and wants to incorporate either change or actively help you find a solution, you feel that because it's conversational. It's, what made you feel that way? What can we do in your mind to make this a better place or improve the situation going on? Like, what would it look like to you? And they may even share their own personal experiences or something that they've struggled with to try and resonate and understand what you're going through, but they make that effort. And without having that effort, I know I've used the word safe space a lot, but I think it just really reiterates the importance of feeling safe and that you can communicate with people around you and with people who may be in a higher up position without that level of intimidation or judgment.
Yeah, I think in your answer actually dovetails nicely into a specific question I had. And Tara, I was going to ask you if you could field this one, but Brianna talked a lot about how creating a safe space and being a leader who is listening and can actually hear and is hearing what's being said. For you personally, and I know I've talked to you and I've known you for a while, and I know that you have a great team and a great relationship with them. What are some specific things that you were able to do to show your team that you are listening, that you hear them?
So one of the things that I learned in my leadership class, it was something that I still use today. They sent us a little plaque to keep on our desk that says, "Be here now." So really focusing on your team member when you're having that meeting, silencing your phone, turning off your email, turning off Teams. My one exception is if I see the school prefix on my phone, I will take that because when school calls, there's something serious going on. And my team knows that. But otherwise, I am trying to focus solely on them. And I think it's even more important in this Zoom environment. I don't see my team every day. I definitely when we were in the office and I had gone, had this training, I stopped doing meetings in my office and we went to a conference room. So then we were like not distracted. We were just face to face. I have my agenda, always having sort of time generally at the beginning to just check in, like, how's the day go? I don't want to say chit chat because that perhaps diminishes what it is, but it's just having that time to connect, to figure out what's going on, lead into the conversation about whatever, generally a monthly one-on-one meeting. And really, having active listening, asking questions, not to, yeah, like, all of that, really being there for them, I think helps you be empathetic, to get the most out of the conversation, to then be able to give back to them for whatever questions, concerns, needs they have in the situation. So those would be my tips for showing your employees kind of how to do it on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I think that's great. The chit chat, like you say, I mean, going back to, I think one of the initial comments that was made in this entire thing is building relationships. That's where it all starts. So it's exactly spot on. So just a quick reminder to everyone tuning in, the chat is live and we will go to your question if you have one. So again, feel free to put that in the chat. But, I wanted to now just bring it back to all of you. I have a question for all of you regarding how a leader can kind of navigate through this. What are some pitfalls that you see? And we've kind of touched on this a bit, so maybe it might just be reiterating some of these with boundaries and things, but any pitfalls we haven't talked about are things that a leader should be mindful of as they're practicing being empathetic. And because, for some people, it isn't just second nature. So what are some pitfalls that you might see a leader stumble into? And Brianna, I'll come to you, especially because I know that you said that you have had some leadership that wasn't quite so empathetic in the past.
So a few things, I think, aside from being judgment-free and listening objectively, this kind of tailors into that, is not to be reactive, because what someone may tell you may not be something you want to hear, or may be something that you might find triggering in a way. You don't want to be reactive because this person felt comfortable enough to open up to you. So if you need to take a minute before you respond, that's okay, to figure out how you need to respond to someone without making them uncomfortable, casting that judgment, maybe just being reactive or yelling. Like, let's say someone comes to you and they made a mistake, because none of us are perfect. We're all going to make mistakes in our career. You're so much more likely to want to tell someone and open up about it if you don't feel like they're going to yell at you, judge you. You can be upset that someone made a mistake, or you may not be thrilled, but there's a way that you can communicate that to them without actually making them uncomfortable and raising your voice or using aggressive body language. Another thing too, I think that we don't take into consideration a lot is the way that we maybe form questions when we're trying to be there for someone. Or if, again, to the mistake example, instead of saying, we use the term why a lot, right? We say, why? Well, why did you do that? Or why do you feel that way? Why as a whole is a little bit of an accusatory word. And if you can think of a way to maybe rephrase what you want to ask. So instead of saying, why did you make a mistake? Or why didn't you do that? You can ask someone, is there a different way this could have been done? Or what would you do differently now that we see the outcome of the situation? And I think it's just really important to be mindful of not only what you're saying, but how you're saying it to someone.
Yeah, and your answer actually made me think specifically to some examples in my life, but personal. So I'm going to flip the question a little bit for Nikki and Tara as I come to you. So still, pitfalls from a leadership perspective, but I'll also open it up to pitfalls from a personal perspective too. I know, Nikki, you mentioned earlier a personal example of empathy. what are some pitfalls that someone just might fall into in general, whether personally or professionally? And Tara, I'll go ahead with you.
I would, sort of building on what Brianna said, not going to just why, right? Like, why this? I think you may not, you may need to dig deeper. And the question is, how do you do that? And then, so don't jump to why, but to unpacking and trying to get to the root of whatever the situation is, and looking at it from a different perspective, making sure that you've gathered all the information versus assuming or accepting that premise that your employee or team member has, so that you can figure out how to fix it, build on it, pivot, whatever the exact situation is. So I think Brianna's, really spot on. So I was wanted to say that I think you really sometimes need to take a step back and figure out how in that conversation to get to the root of what's really going on, make sure you have all the information versus just sort of taking it, jumping, and then finding out, oh, like there was a whole other story, because you want to be empathetic, you want to believe or accept or all those words, what your employee is telling you, but then you're like, no, there was there's a perspective, there's a nuance, and you want to make sure you have all of that before you go acting on whatever that nugget piece of information conversation was.
I think that applies personally and professionally for sure. And how about you, Nikki?
Well, in my role, and I think there's probably a lot of people on this call that may be in a similar situation. I think if you're practicing empathy publicly in front of a large group of people or your team, or even if it's a small group, to always be mindful of your audience. So for example, I think about the pandemic, don't focus on how a crisis, might be affecting your organization's profits or other financial measures. On the inside, am I concerned? Absolutely. Am I thinking about ways to help employers and different solutions, which could also, provide more revenue? Absolutely. But on the outside, it's all about them and what's going on in their world. So just, I would say that be careful with not focusing too much on the wrong things publicly.
Yeah, and actually that leads in nicely to a question I had for you specifically, Nikki, about your team. And like you said, what's going on with them and making sure that you're being cognizant of that. So how does empathy help keep our teams productive? It's an ever-changing world. It's been mentioned several times on here, now we're in the Zoom world and we're not seeing our teams all the time and everything is changing minute by minute. How does empathy help keep our employees productive?
There's three things that really come to mind in this category. And the first one is that empathy decreases conflict, right? So if we've got a common understanding of emotions and motivations, then that risk of conflict comes down. So if Tara's working on her workers' comp program, and let's say I'm responsible for employee health and wellness, it's not about which department is who, where, what, when, why. It's about keeping the perspective. What's the underlying motivation? So trying not to blame others or other departments, pointing fingers, things like that. Empathy really helps with decreasing that conflict. The second one is it makes giving feedback easier and receiving it too, right? So if you're meeting with your teams on a project, there's a lot of situations where I'm leading a team and they don't report to me. They're in another department. They could work for another company. And so giving feedback and using empathy is so, so very important. I think if you ask things like, how are things going for you? It really gives them that chance to open up. And I know we've kind of talked about that a little bit, but that will, hinder productivity there. The third thing is empathy reduces the stress. So if you foster empathy in the workplace, you're going to create that more collaborative environment. You're going to strengthen those relationships with the people that you're working with. And ultimately, that's going to reduce stress levels. What happens, we talked about this so much. If you're coming back from WCI, it was all about attraction and retention and avoiding burnout. So empathy, right there, it should be on the top of your list. Empathy to avoid that burnout. So yeah, those would be my 3 for productivity.
Yeah, empathy decreases stress. I think that's so true. We've all been in a place, I'm sure, where it is unnecessary stress because we are working with someone, whether leadership or cross-functionally, that is not empathetic. And that's a really great point, Nikki.
And what's all of that unnecessary stress leads to unproductivity, right? You're sitting there and you're focused and you're heated. Should I send this email back? I'm going to save it as a draft. Think about it. It's just unproductive.
Exactly. And leads to burnout because there's already regular stress and then you pile more on top. It's going to get there so much quicker. And Tara, did you want to add to this?
Yeah, I think, building off of what Nikki said, specifically kind of about WCI, because I was there with her, that it really leads to engagement. If we want to have a productive team and we want team members to stay, which is really quite the issue these days of people moving around, I think being an empathetic leader, you hopefully have built those connections with your employees and made a sense of community, have that connection with them, and yes, they might be able to go get more money, or they might be able to do something slightly different. But I think if they have that connection, if they really see you as a leader that they trust, those other things might not be as important because yes, it might be, is it really greener on the other side, right? Like, who you're working with, who that person is. And I think it will really lead to engagement and hopefully like a stickiness of that person with you, with the company, so that they aren't just like looking over the fence at what's, ooh, maybe I should go there. So I think it really can be a very important skill for, today's challenging talent acquisition and retention market.
Yeah, I mean, that is spot on from my perspective as well, Tara. I think if you have someone you like working for, then everything else just kind of falls into place. Because we spend more time at work with people we work with and sometimes our own families. So yeah, I think that is exactly spot on. So in these last couple minutes, I have a question for all of you, just kind of a practical question for the people listening. So I have I've been taking notes, so I have good takeaways. So hopefully everyone else on the call is as well. But just from a practical perspective, and Tara, you had mentioned earlier specific training and obviously leadership training, you had said too, Nikki, but what are some actual tools that you can recommend or that you suggest, whether it's books, podcasts, talking to peers, whatever it is, what are some tools that everyone listening today can take away and have some tangible ideas of how to hone this skill? And Brianna, I'll start with you.
That's a great question. I think there's several parts to that. So one, finding something for you that creates happiness for you, whether that be, let's just say, a workout class or something that you do to relieve your stress. Because if you can't relieve your stress, it's harder for you to check your biases, to not jump to judgment right away because you're probably not necessarily happy. You want to be, of course, you're not going to be happy all the time, but you want to, for the most part, be happy with what you're doing in life or in your personal life, not even just career-wise. So I think that's an important factor of empathy that kind of gets overlooked a little bit, because you have to be able to be happy with yourself and be happy with what's going on in life. And then another thing, I would say there are really great books out there. There are some podcasts. I had just started listening to one. I have to remember what the name of it was, but it was great. It was about leading with empathy. And I listen to it when I go on long drives or if I'm driving into the office during the week. I also think utilizing either podcasts, literature that maybe are not just empathy and honing in on other skills related to empathy. So maybe a book or a podcast relating to judgment and body language, because body language is a huge part. You can say you're listening and you're here for someone, but if I'm sitting like this and I'm closed off and I'm turned, or if I'm looking away, I'm not engaged in the conversation. And that doesn't exactly give the warm and fuzzy feel to be empathetic towards other people. So I think it's also honing in on the skills that surround empathy as well.
That's fantastic. The self-care tip, I think that's excellent. And I agree with you, completely overlooked. If you are coming in on a bad day, good luck trying to be empathetic. So yes, I think that's fantastic. So Tara, how about you? What are some thoughts on skills?
Yeah, again, in preparing for today, I went back to a lot of my leadership training materials because it was a very analytical way that that my company sort of taught, identified and really helped us build on skills that we had, but maybe didn't have the words and the framework to truly understand how they all go together. And as I went through my notebook and then also went back to the Korn Ferry website last night, I was like, wow, I really should stop and think about some of this more frequently versus being so caught up in the moment of the pressures of work and the focus on outcomes and what I have to do, and balancing that with my personal life and the chaos of having two teenagers. Like, it's fun. And so I don't know what my solution is going to be, but I hope that I can find time to go beyond the materials I already have. Like, there were different books recommended that I will not try to find on the website right now, but there were things that I think I can and need to find time to incorporate into my life so that I don't get too far away from these skills that are important, not just for leadership to Lumen, but a lot of them really do work in one's personal life. So I think my recommendation is, whatever it is that speaks to you, do try to really find that time. And it was definitely reminding to me that I need to do that myself.
And then Nikki, how about you to round us out? What are some tips you have to hone these skills?
Well, if I were a betting woman, Lori, I would say that most of us on this call already have some free resources available. So your employer probably has modules or training or something out there, and some of it might have been required or mandatory at one point, and you're just, you're multitasking and you're going through the motions and clicking the buttons and not paying attention. But maybe revisit those and take some notes. I have to be on LinkedIn a lot for work. And so I often find myself using LinkedIn Learning. There's a lot of really great sessions on LinkedIn Learning. But I think the biggest thing, and because most of you are leaders on this call, the best way to learn something is to teach something. So, if you have the opportunity to host a discussion like this or to provide a training yourself, that's when things are going to really set into motion, and that stuff's really going to start sticking for you.
That's great.
One other thing I was just thinking of that I didn't mention that I would recommend is doing a DISC assessment.
Mm-hmm.
And what that is it's a personality assessment, essentially. The D is for dominance, I is for influence, S is steadiness, and C is conscientiousness. And it helps you figure out what your communication style is, but then you can go even further and it will help you communicate with people who are a different communication style. So that also is a really good way to foster empathy within your organization and the people around you.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's a great way to wrap this up as well, because really what that goes back then to is understanding both yours and other people's communication styles. And that is a really great way to start practicing empathy, is by just understanding what's going on with the people around you. So I want to thank all of you for being a part of this conversation. I have great takeaways. I think, building relationships, standing firm with your boundaries, I think is personally a big takeaway for me. Be here now. I love that, Tara. And empathy, decreasing conflict and decreasing stress, I think is a big takeaway for all of us from a leadership perspective. So thank you for the time and care you put into these answers. This is an ever evolving, ever learning opportunity for us. And so I just thank you for the opportunity to speak to our members through this webinar. So for everyone else on the webinar, we are recording this, so we will post it to our website later in the week. And so tell your friends, have them come learn about empathy too. And thank you again, and just have a great rest of your day.